Welcome. This is Leonard Lee, Managing Director of neXt. Thank you for joining today's Rethink webinar. And in this session, we will be discussing what may be the biggest global security threat of the modern era, Meltdown and Spectre. And for those of you who are not familiar with neXt, let me introduce you to our firm really quickly. We are a San Diego-based boutique consulting and research firm focused on providing experience-based advisory services to inspire our clients' digital future. And we advise across a wide range of digital topics drawing from the expertise and experience of our executive consultants and analysts. I started neXt with the goal of channeling my 23 years of experience consulting across a wide range of industries and business, technology, and strategy advisory domains, and helping my clients win and move forward with clarity into the cloudy frontier that is our digital future. And I also wanted to work with some great people like our featured neXt principals who will be joining me on this panel discussion. And today, I'm very honored to be joined by neXt principal Akshay Sharma. Akshay is a renowned industry analyst and consultant who has been working with some of the leading tech firms and was a research director with Gartner Inc. for 10 years. And as a principal with neXt, Akshay covers various domains, including blockchain, network and data center technologies, IoT communication, security, and telecom digital transformation. And I'm also honored and excited to introduce Dean Freeman, our newest principal. Dean has a distinguished 17-year career with Gartner as a research vice president with the semiconductor group. Dean's research focus was on the semiconductor forecast and leading the Internet of Things Center of Excellence. And we welcome his expertise on various IoT topics and his deep knowledge of the semiconductor industry and market. So Dean, Akshay, thank you both for being on this panel today. Yeah, I'm looking forward to having some great discussion.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you, Leonard.
All right, let's move on to our next topic, which is tackling the great security risk of our time. I think at the moment, most business leaders are scratching their heads wondering, well, how do I get a grasp on what Meltdown and Spectre really mean in terms of risk? And hopefully we've helped them with the discussion thus far. They're probably also asking themselves, what should we do about it? Or what should I do about it? And how do I get started? One of the things that I wanted to do here is share a framework that Dean, Akshay, and I have come up with to help businesses as well as individuals get your Meltdown and Spectre remediation journey started. What I'd like to do is walk through our recommended approach here with Dean and Akshay. And the very first important step is to assess the risk to yourself as well as your business. And coming up with a risk assessment framework or working with someone that can help develop a risk assessment framework for your business. And I think each company, each enterprise, each individual has a different type of risk profile that they're working with. Having someone support you going through this first phase, which is risk assessment, is very important. Second, the Meltdown Spectre risk could be quite large and may require significant investment over time. Business leaders will want to prioritize their investments and react to the highest risk threats that are identified in that first step, which is the assess step.
I agree. In fact, I think we're going to see newer audits and assessments on organizations. We're going to see what kind of governance they have, what type of reporting structure. Do they have a CISO? What are their qualifications? Do they have the budget necessary to make things happen if it's needed? We're starting to also see new insurance companies provide cybersecurity as an insurance policy. We just saw an announcement by Apple yesterday with Cisco Systems. We're going to see more and more of these type of alliances form where insurance brokers like AIG or Aon and others announce business cybersecurity with insurance policies, and they're going to charge premiums, but in that premium they charge, just like we have insurance for fire or theft, and they say, oh, do you have door locks? Do you have an alarm system? Well, now they're going to say, do you have you done a vulnerability assessment? Have you deployed any malware detection, any intrusion detection software, or probes? What kind of probes? What are the vendors? Do you have, firewalls? Things like that. So we're going to see newer type of business opportunities occur.
Dean, anything to add?
No, I think that covers it very nicely with respect to the overall prioritization and, into this. You're going to have folks jumping on this bandwagon very quickly. And it's going to be interesting to see what the RTOS companies do to see if they can jump in and help design some solutions down in that operating system to make sure that you can protect yourselves and protect the memory.
That point is a good segue into the next step, which is the planning part, right? Where you put together a remediation strategy and roadmap. And the important thing here is, number one, understand the nature of the risk and threat that you're facing with Meltdown and Spectre, but more importantly, taking a holistic approach in building the strategy. And when you start to look at the different categories of solutions that you need to apply to different aspects of your Meltdown and Spectre risk profile, that's where, Akshay, what you and Dean mentioned about thinking outside of the box and working with partners to come up with alternative or interim solutions is very important. Because for some of these scenarios that you're going to face, risk scenarios that you're going to face, there really isn't a final solution.
Exactly. So what we're going to need is, like I said, the proper hygiene, the proper diagnostic tools, the proper analysis, but it's not going to be a one size fit all, just like Dean was mentioning. Before we could basically put a firewall, I got an intrusion detection, malware detection, DDoS, session border controller for voice over IP, and I'm fine. Or I got a Palo Alto Networks firewall and I'm fine. Well, now even Palo Alto Networks has moved up the food chain with holistic offerings with their traps, and we're starting to see more and more endpoint protection along with data center protection, and we're going to see more holistic type of solutions come out as we move forward.
Okay, and then finally, you're going to want to take that plan and that strategy and start executing and initiating the remediation of your IoT environments, as well as your other digital business environments. That would be the 4-phase approach that we would recommend to business leaders as they look to begin their journey toward remediation. The other important thing to consider here is how you're going to govern this remediation. I guess you can almost consider it a transformation, because it is. It's really going from the kind of security posture you have today and practices and infrastructure to moving to something that is kind of net new for a lot of us, just because the nature of this security threat is quite different from what we've encountered before. And so you're going to be working with a much broader suite of constituents as you move forward with this remediation journey. You're going to be working tightly with vendors. So we're not just talking about device vendors. Dean, you mentioned earlier about really understanding what the roadmap is at the silicon level, whether it's a microcontroller or a processor.
Exactly. And so, I think as Akshay has mentioned throughout this presentation, it is a holistic approach, but it can't be done in a vacuum. The silicon vendor has to be working with whoever the IoT or device manufacturer is. The device manufacturer needs to be working with his communications supply chain. Whether that be in the United States, it's an AT&T or Verizon. In Japan, it's Docomo. In Europe, it's one of the multiple European providers that are out there. So has to be holistic that incorporates multiple players and multiple constituents in order to be successful.
Those traditionally weren't dependencies before, and now they are to your plan. at certain points in their roadmap, they can present some enablers for you to institute more robust solutions up the chain. That's one of the things that's really different about what we're looking at here with Spectre and Meltdown remediation. And then also, we mentioned before the service providers. You need to start working with them and understand what sort of risks they present to you as well as your enterprise. You need to engage corporate tech folks, and I don't mean just CIOs. And Dean, you mentioned CIO before, but it's broader than that, right? It's folks who are developing your products that you might be selling to customers, or even the services that you're providing to your customers. Mm-hmm. And then finally, of course, the business stakeholders, right? It's very important for these folks, number one, to understand what the threat is and get real about it, because the potential impact and damage is yet to come in large part. And we talked about that clock, right? That threat clock. But they need to understand what the potential damage to the business can be. And I think that's where you need to establish this governance model and program model to not only get your program up and running, but to start communicating and getting people engaged in the remediation effort.
Yeah, exactly, Leonard.
Wow, this is a great conversation. We're at the end of our discussion time, but one last point I want to make. This process is going to be iterative in all likelihood because, as Dean mentioned, the fixes are not completely in place, right? And we continue to introduce vulnerable devices into our portfolio. So the threat is going to continue for the foreseeable future until there is a final fix, but you're in all likelihood going to be iterating through these 4 phases that we're talking about. And so you're not going to have a static strategy and plan. It's a dynamic, evolving plan over time as fixes progress at the silicon level, the devices get fixed at a device level and on up. And so that's the other thing that you need to understand here is that it's not a one-time exercise. You really need to put this program together and enforce an iterative cadence to the remediation process. So with that, let's recap with our recommendations for business leaders. Akshay, if you don't mind.
Sure. Any comments? As we've mentioned, we need a holistic, multi-layered approach. Any comments, Leonard or Dean?
This is not just a network or a software bug or malware. This is something much more profound and has a huge impact on the entire install base of devices out there, as well as devices that are yet to be sold.
No, I'm in full agreement with that.
And the next recommendation for business leaders is to quickly qualify and communicate the Meltdown and Spectre related risk. Communication is important. We're all learning together. So hopefully solutions that we're finding out will be updated in a timely way. And there's going to be multiple solutions. It's not just a patch. It's not just putting up firewalls.
Yeah, I think this is critical for vendors. I think Intel may or may not have been as forthcoming as they could have been with some of their end users. But I think now that the cat is out of the bag, so to speak, that the communications are coming more quickly. Now it's just a question of how quickly we can get the solution communicated and the patches out there with respect to what's going on.
Your citation there of Intel is really important. As a business, you need to understand the liability and the risk that this threat presents. The communications from Intel has been slow. Even at CES, they didn't really talk about the threat at all, right? They went off and, demonstrated the drones and talked about how great the drones were when there's this million-pound elephant in the room. I think it's important for enterprises to get very real, but communicate, and it's very important to establish that baseline understanding and be equipped with the right messages to go to your various constituents to start managing the risk. And going back to number one very quickly, I think the point I want to make here is that going to your CISO for this is not going to be good enough. This is a different type of problem, and you really need to take much more of a holistic approach. For instance, at neXt, we have folks like Dean who actually know the semiconductor industry, the markets, the history of it. Having that kind of insight down at the ground level of our digital world, that's important insight that you need to be able to leverage as you have these higher level discussions up the stack. That's one of the things that I think is important for business leaders to understand. Is this is not a traditional issue that we're seeing here in terms of security. That means that you need to start looking beyond just traditional roles and responsibilities.
Great. And now we're starting to see other recommendations like establishing a decision framework to prioritize the remediation investments.
I think this just boils down to the fact that in all likelihood, the investments for remediation are going to be pretty large. And I think in order to ensure that you are making high value investment, and what I mean by value is that they're going to have the highest risk mitigating value is important. And being able to establish this decision framework for your enterprise is very important. It's going to be tailored for your business, right? There may be certain industry nuances, but based on my experience, most companies have very different environments, right? Different architectures that they've built their technical infrastructure and IT environments and IoT environments with. So it's very difficult to sit there and apply a cookie cutter approach to the problem.
It is going to be a big chunk of change, and they are going to have to prioritize it, but they need to make sure that they cover all their bases. It's going to be an interesting relationship between both the vendors as well as the end users on how to prioritize that, and it's going to need to be very closely coordinated.
Exactly, and that's a good segue to the fourth bullet point here about establishing a project management office to manage the vendors and your service providers. And the interesting point here is, I mean, the vendors we've talked about a lot, but the carriers, the AT&Ts, the Verizons, the NTT Docomos, the Vodafones, they all have something to say as well, because a lot of these attacks will go through their network to your device, to your IoT device, and the carrier has something to say here as well.
Yeah, just to add on to that, you covered most of the carriers, but you also need to talk about most of the internet service providers that are in there as well. Some of their modems that go in home, the box that we all use for our Wi-Fi, we don't know what the risk is on that. If they're an Intel-based processor in there, then there's some risks in there. If it's an ASIC, maybe where you've got better security on that system and on that device. But that's going to be something that's going to have to be explored very closely, because most of us homeowners and the consumers use that box as our firewall and are very probably too trusting of our ISPs to help to manage our internet security.
When you think about how liberal most consumers are about their security, it is quite concerning.
And the last point here, we need to continuously assess the threat coming into your IoT portfolio. We've mentioned that it's a holistic assessment, right down to the log files of your IT administrator, right down to the entire behavioral analysis. Who's doing what, when, and where to your devices. And literally, we're going to take, surveillance cameras. We're going to look at log files. We're going to look at our servers. Look at even the server door. Who typed it in with what badge? When did they badge in? So truly, we're going to take security from a holistic point of view and then do behavioral analysis on it and then figure out what are the threats that need to be mitigated.
As we've seen just from the internet as a whole, you get something fixed and the hackers figure out how to break it. It's an ongoing process. And I think with the Internet of Things coming to the forefront and more, we'll call it accessibility and more surface area for threats to come in, enterprises need to be much more aware of what the potential attacks can be and be ready to go fix them, or already have things into place that will mitigate any potential damage from those attacks.
I think we're getting close to being up on time here. So we have a little bit of time for Q&A, and believe it or not, we have 3 questions. The first one here is, from a layman's perspective, how would you describe going about assessing a company's risk profile, e.g. appetite for risk?
First of all, I think everyone is going to be a security auditor. The wake-up call has been sent that we're responsible, just like we're responsible for looking both ways as we cross the street, or we lock our doors when we leave our home or our cars or our offices. We're going to now start to make sure to check our security firewall, our malware detection, our software, and making sure that we're up to date now. And so, there's simple hygiene functions, keeping multiple passwords that are different and unique on different devices, and making sure we keep changing them, things like that. Not using, stored passwords on devices. That's what we've seen with the Spectre and Meltdown vulnerabilities with shared access to shared memory. Those could be your passwords that are being accessed by a botnet. Simple things that are hygienic in nature can be done.
This is actually an interesting question. How would you go about assessing a company's risk profile? I think a lot of it has to do with looking at the end of the day, the applications that you support. And what I mean by application is really the IoT application, whether it's optimizing, let's say, a oil refinery or a rig, or operating a plane, and determining what risk does a failure or compromise of that application present to health, safety, and then also from a business perspective, liability and obligations that you have contractually with your customers. There's a number of ways that you could apply a taxonomy to do that kind of assessment across the portfolio of services that you provide. Now, it's daunting, right? Because we're not talking about, oh, hey, let's go and assess the risk of our CRM systems, or let's go and assess the risk of our data center. You have to take almost an entirely holistic lens to your entire business and the kind of digital services or digitally enabled services or anything that's connected that could somehow be impacted by Meltdown and Spectre, and profile that. And then what you'll probably find is about anywhere from 50 to 80% of your business is exposed. And then you would have to go and then start prioritizing based on risk levels. So exactly. I don't know how layman of a perspective that is, but that would be the general approach that I think business leaders should take in qualifying the risk.
Well, for example, it was in the Target hack, it was the heating, ventilation, and AC control system that someone hacked through to get access to a common server farm, which had the credit card information for the Target consumers. Right. And so, a simple assessment of who's logging into my HVAC system and logging that, making sure it's only the right people, and then also ensuring that they're separate firewalls, inter-application firewalls. Should the HVAC software be able to access something else? No, it shouldn't have been able to. So those are the things you could audit.
Okay, well, we have another question here for Dean. So how big an issue will this be for the IoT? And as we are developing products, are there any kind of workarounds?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second half of that question first from a workaround perspective. You've got to start working with your vendors immediately to find out what the patches are, when they're going to happen, and when you can implement them and install them. And if you don't have a patch, you need to look at replacing that device or shutting down that device pretty quickly if it's a device that's at risk out there. It just means working very closely with the silicon provider to see what's out there, and then working with your operating system provider, software provider, to make sure that you're safe and covered. Now, the impact of this could be your entire IoT system that you put out there. It could be your endpoint could be at risk, your edge processing could be at risk, your communication system could be at risk, and your server or cloud could be at risk. So it could be pretty extensive from an IoT perspective if you've happened to use a semiconductor chip that has exposure to both the Spectre and the Meltdown. So pretty significant.
Great. Thanks, Dean. And seems like one final question here. This is for Akshay. Standalone endpoint detection and response is so yesterday and reactive. What do you feel is the way to solve this?
We're starting to see managed security service providers that use AI and machine learning applied to the analytics that are captured. So I mentioned the log files, but there's also probes that can be used to proactively monitor the devices. So I think moving forward, we're going to see not only endpoint security, but we're going to see security as a service. And hopefully it's done by a trusted partner, or maybe it's internally done by your IT staff, but we're going to see more and more of these dashboards come up. So there's companies like Cybraics that do data mining of all the behavioral analytics, the log files, who did what, when, and where, and to see if there's any anomalous behavior happening. We're going to see companies like Clarium Technologies that basically host Palo Alto's traps and firewall capability, as well as Cisco and Juniper virtualized firewalls. And we're going to see companies do this as a service, where not only are they having dashboards and doing the auditing and monitoring, but then also the remediation as a service, where they're going to instantiate firewalls when they see an attack coming from, let's say, North Korea, and before it hits the US, they've already updated accordingly. Because as we're seeing, you know, the patch we had yesterday is likely not going to be relevant today. And so it's a continuous journey to go down this path.
Okay, we have another question. So social engineering play in regards to security assessment. Does a company's culture, leadership, even at play here with regards to security strategy? For example, the Hawaii Islands fiasco, a false missile alarm attack, the Equifax patch failure.
My perspective, security comes from the top, got to be designed in. And this is what Akshay has really been harping on as you go through. It's got to be a holistic approach. If the CEO, CIO doesn't believe in having a strong, firm security system in place, you're going to struggle and you're going to be at risk. And most when the IoT first started, security was an afterthought. It was too expensive to design in. People didn't understand the risks. People didn't understand that the video camera example that Akshay has been using is a great example. You know, the company just said, here's the cameras. Don't worry about having any firewalls in there. Oh, by the way, the password is, video camera. You don't need to change that. Look what happened. It shut down the entire East Coast for, a day. So
I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay.
No. So it's got to, it's huge. It's got to start at the top, and it's got to be pervasive in the company, and it's got to be a holistic approach.
Exactly. In fact, I think, experience counts, qualifications count. And in the Equifax breach, while the lady in charge as the CISO there might have been really good and nice, but at the end, she was a music major. And nothing against music majors, musicians are smart people, but she may not have had the experience. So.
Yeah. Hey, I'm a musician. Okay, don't go there.
Yeah, no.
All right. Well, hey, look, guys, this is all the time we have. Wow, we're like way over. It's been incredible. It's been a great discussion, and I think that's all we have for time for the Q&A. And thanks for those who have asked questions. They were great questions. We're gonna have to close out here. So. If you would like to find out more about the next Curve points of view on this and other digital topics of the day, go to our website. It's www.next-curve.com. You'll find research notes by Dean, Akshay, and other next Curve principals, media and replays of this and other webinars on our site. And to keep up to date on all the great stuff we're doing here at neXt, follow us on our website by subscribing, and you'll be automatically notified when we publish and post new insights and research. And we'll also be launching a subscription-based channel with exclusive content for our executive members. And we are also on Twitter and YouTube. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and friend us on Twitter to get live feeds and coverage of industry conferences that we attend and special neXt events. And the next conference we'll be attending is Mobile World Congress, and we have a ton of briefings set up, and Akshay and Dean will be there with me in spirit and virtually covering the action there. Taking the first step, we've talked about the remediation, risk assessment and remediation strategy that we recommend that you put in place in reaction to the Meltdown and Spectre threats. Well, if you would like neXt to advise you on your first step on your Meltdown and Spectre remediation journey, a great way to start is our executive workshop program, which focuses on helping you and your organization develop that holistic strategy that we've been talking about, that remediation plan that we're talking about, and ultimately a roadmap that will get you down the path of remediation. And the outcome of this engagement is a set of deliverables that will be vital in communicating the Meltdown and Spectre risks to your business and to all the internal and external constituents that you're going to need as part of your program. It also supports critical resource and investment decisions that you're going to have to make, and helps you mobilize your organization, partners, and vendors in moving forward on your path to Meltdown, Spectre, risk mitigation, and remediation. We also have a number of other engagement options that can fit the needs of your organization, from custom research projects, executive workshops that we just talked about, and expert panels and inquiries that we provide as well. And so that's a really nice way for you to get in touch with Dean and Akshay and myself to get some spot advisory on the topic of Meltdown and Spectre and how you can go down this path of remediation. Now, if you have any questions, contact me by email or telephone. This is Leonard Lee for a scoping discussion to figure out how neXt can be part of your next step with Meltdown and Spectre, risk mitigation and remediation. And with that, thank you everyone for attending. Akshay, Dean, any last words for our audience?
Yeah, thank you, Leonard. This was great.
Yes.
Absolutely, it was great fun. Yeah, and Dean, thank you so much. I'm really happy to finally have you on one of these webinars, and I can only expect that we're going to have some more fun ahead.
Sounds good.
All right, thank you all. Have a wonderful day.
All right, Leonard. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.
Cheers.